computer.
Yeah. Hello. This is just a podcast from Left Foot Forward Media. Essentially, it involves myself and my friend Anthony Vernon. We both work in business. I'm a local commentator in Belfast. I'm also making a documentary at the minute in relation to the Concora Boys Home scandal and writing a book. In that, Anthony's a student of political science and works in the business sector in America. And we've come together. We wish to basically have a discussion that we think is relevant with every facet of people's lives, and that concerns the topic of neoliberalism. Now, many of you won't actually be familiar with the political jargon as to what that actually means, but we're going to try and break it down and explain it to people and give them day-to-day examples as to how it impacts their lives and what they can do to try and rectify the rot that has spread because of it. So the first question basically is, what is neoliberalism? So over to you, Anthony.
Thanks, Donal. Neoliberalism, well, it's taken on a bit of a life of its own in terms of its meaning, but neoliberalism at its core is both an economic and a political ideology. It comes born largely out of the University of Chicago School of Economics, although it's been dated back to 17th century, yes, as far back as classical Adam Smith and classical Enlightenment thinkers. But it's taken off probably since 1978, around the Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan time period. But essentially what it means is it puts an emphasis on deregulation of the economy based on the political theory of individual liberty. But that concept of individual liberty is translated into a corporation acting as an individual. So deregulation in theory is allowing that corporation to act with the same rights and the same laws and the same
as a
human being. So therefore, by deregulating it, you are encouraging the individual liberty to be pursued at its own on its own volition, to do whatever it wants, operate across borders
without accountability.
No accountability, no transparency to its accounting practices, its auditory practices. They're very deceptive. But it also conceives of human beings as individuals operating in their own world without the ideas or principles of community, of solidarity, of association with others, working together. It only perceives what's called rational consumers, making rational choices in a market society. But you only have to turn on a TV to understand that people don't make rational choices based on rational information. For instance, but in America, I can give a few examples in the UK, but in America, you're allowed to advertise on political campaigns and basically show negative advertisements about a particular candidate, and it's done in like a short space of time, maybe 60 seconds, around very about sound bites of what their campaign is about. So for example, you'd see something about Joe Biden is being bought by China, and then it'll shift to something else. So that idea is basically assumed that the person then going to the voting box is making a rational choice about voting for Donald Trump rather than Joe Biden, based on the idea that Joe Biden's being bought by China. But what it doesn't do is substantiate that claim. It doesn't allow you to justify that claim. It doesn't turn that argument into a long form discussion. And by theory, it's people who voted for Donald Trump have done so on a rational basis. You also see it with cars. You know, you turn on the television, and then the car isn't being sold on its merits of engineering. It's being sold on the idea of what it makes you feel. You know, the sexy actress or the model or the windswept hair, or all of these.
The sexualization of commercialism.
Absolutely. So it induces desires rather than induces desires based to consume rather than based on what you need.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a quote about it where it was someone described it that usually with neoliberalism, that which is desirable is not obtainable, and that which is obtainable is not even desirable.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it very much, it gives people this idea in their head about what they ought to look like, what they ought to work at, what way their family should be, what car they should drive, what clothes they should wear. It encompasses far more than just a political ideology, so to speak. I mean, really, it's a set of ideas, and they're evil ideas. Not to say that to say. I mean, I'm not saying that the people who perpetuate them or propagate them are evil people, so to speak. I mean, many of them are not, but the idea in itself of me, now, loads of money, and F everybody else, so to speak. I mean, that I think is a really evil concept. And
it is.
I mean, the lack of community, the lack of society, the lack of regulation, the lack of structure has resulted in a culture of mass suicides and deep discontent, whereby people are just wasting away, spending their lives on Instagram, with constant envy as to what their neighbor or friend is getting up to, that they feel, well, I ought to be doing that, and it's causing the anxiety and depression levels to rise constantly.
Absolutely. So if the argument you always get back from a neoliberal will be, well, people don't have to buy a pair of shoes from Nike every 6 weeks when they change their product line. They must want those shoes, so the company's only acting in the based on the market demand and what consumers want. That's kind of the argument you always get back. Well, they're not doing anything wrong. That people must want these things, but it assumes that people do make rational choices. It also assumes
it assumes that manipulation of human beings is an ethical business practice. Yes,
exactly, and it also assumes that the person has all of the available information at the time of purchase or at the time of the decision being made, and we just know that's not true.
Yeah.
Second to that, your point about mass suicides and depression. So since 1978, particularly in the US, since this financialization and deregulation phase, what it's done is it's allowed corporations to consolidate power in society much greater than what they had before, because they're not being regulated by the government. The government acts in the public's behalf, and therefore there's some accountability on how these corporations behave. Now that the industries are deregulated, they've been able to buy up smaller businesses, make a lot more acquisitions, consolidate their market position. Therefore, they control both the supply and demand side of the economic equation, which means that when you're, as a laborer, like a working class laborer, when you go to work, and the only choices you've got are between McDonald's, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, Amazon, and all of them have the same philosophy where you're not allowed to unionize, or else they'll shut down the warehouse. You're not allowed to, even the threat of entering into a union, you're
blacklisted.
You're blacklisted. What else does it do? Because it owns the demand and supply side economics, it drives down your wages. If it forces you as an individual into competition with developing nations, sweatshops. And now somebody in the neoliberals or let's call it the right wing, would say, oh, but the person can just leave. That's based on a choice. Well,
yes, but I mean, leave to what? What's
exactly.
I mean, you're going from one set of perpetrators to another. I mean, and people will opt for the whole old niche of "it's better the devil you know."
Exactly. So what that does is it creates atomization. You're an individual. You can't associate yourself with others. It's very hard to unionize. So it's very hard to ask for pay rises. It's very hard to fight for those things and demand better working conditions. You're at the mercy and subservience to power, which is actually the total
unaccountable.
It's unaccountable. It's tyrannical. I mean, the concept of a corporation, and not even just the United States, but in any country, is the internal structure is the most tyrannical structure of any institution around the world. I mean, Stalin would be proud of some of the internal structures of Amazon and McDonald's, and some of the control that those companies have over people's lives is just insane.
Yeah, you see, one of the examples I would give about it is that in now this is the case in a number of European countries, but if you think about it, now what happened was a series of privatizations across Europe of previously publicly owned entities, whether it was water, gas, electric, you name it, right? And what that meant was people's vote at the ballot box was no longer worth as much regarding those particular things, because where they would have been able to elect men who had policies in relation to certain areas, and women, sack men and women who had those policies, adopt policies, change policies. It removed the option to do that and put it into the private sector. So they outsourced it, so to speak. Yeah. And where there's no democratic, there isn't as much democratic oversight, because the government doesn't want to pass legislation that infringes too much on their mates in the private sector, so to speak. But I mean, one of the things here that we have that I think is noteworthy is that any public service that people are provided with, there is an independent and impartial public service ombudsman. And I mean, it provides at least some safeguards and oversight regarding regulation and a common set of standards based on natural justice. Now, if that's applicable and sufficient for the public sector, you would also ask the question of, well, why can't you have a sufficient equivalent for people working in the private sector? I mean, a lot of businesses here will say that their main problem is turnover regarding staff, staff taking a lot of time off sick, and staff having nervous breakdowns, management and staff, the toxic culture between the both. And I think really the seed of all of that is this particular ideology that just is, I mean, if you go back to before the Thatcher and Reagan period, the 70s, I'll give you an example. The UK during the 3-day working week under a conservative government, when you still had a Keynesian economic economy, there was a mass strike where, they had to conserve energy because the miners went on strike. So you could only work 3 days of the week. The UK was the third happiest country in the world because you had a lot of community and collective endeavors whereby, people out in the street would have cooked a meal for the entire neighborhood, and it was very much a culture of, ordinary people were winning. They were grounded in terms of they were part of community organizations. They were part of, whether it was church groups or education and leisure facilities. My own grandfather, I remember, was, he used to play a lot of darts and go fishing a lot with other people. Those sort of things. They kept people sane and grounded and also unionized.
Absolutely. Well, those things are, every study that I've read certainly are probably some of the most beneficial activities that you can do. Not for the activities in themselves, but the socialization between you and others for solving mental health issues.
I mean, discussion is a radical thing.
Yep, it is. And the other thing that's happened, this is particularly noticeable in the south of Ireland, like in the Republic. One thing I am disappointed with Ireland in the respect that they have swapped British imperialism and colonialism for the financial imperialism of the United States.
I mean, you might say that they have abandoned colonialism from London in favor of financial colonialization from Brussels and Washington.
100%. So what that means is you go down south and you notice a lot of American companies. You notice a lot of foreign entities being registered here. You see a lot of head offices in Dublin being built. And
and also an American military base.
Yeah, exactly. Now the counter argument that is given, I don't think it has any weight, but the one that's given is, oh well, it creates jobs. Okay, well let's just talk about that. What it does do is it invites capital into the Irish economy. Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah, even Hitler created jobs.
Yeah, exactly. Even Hitler created jobs. Second of that capital is coming from a foreign constituency. So therefore, your political leaders that you've elected the Belfast now have two constituents to serve. It has the local and domestic constituents, which is you and me and the rest of society, but it also has a foreign
global,
exactly,
with a global agenda.
And they don't have any accountability to them. So especially a powerful country like the United States could just threaten to say, oh, well, we'll just take our headquarters elsewhere and move them somewhere else. So now the Irish economy and the political system is at the mercy in some respects of somebody else's say on what their threats are. If you don't succumb to this, then we'll take the head offices and register them somewhere else.
I remember one commentator, I forget his name, but he actually referred to the south of Ireland, the economy, as a well-educated nation of whores, in the sense that the only reason that American, German, French, British companies invest in the south of Ireland, well, two reasons. First of all, it's the well-educated workforce, which is a good thing.
Yep.
But secondly, and the most pertinent of all, is the very, very low rate of corporation tax and also the lack of regulation and oversight.
Absolutely. So what that means is in economic terms, it creates what's called capital flight. So capital can move across borders from one country to another really, really quickly, which means the lack of investment in the local economy that actually creates real jobs in the small business sector is less.
Yes.
You're not allowed to invest in R&D, in new technologies for the productive capacity of the Irish economy, and all of the research or innovations are coming from overseas, and therefore the workforce of Ireland and the Irish companies being produced are not as they're not as frequent, they're not as creative, and they're also at risk if America just decides tomorrow to just take those things away and go elsewhere.
You see, one of the things I've noticed, and it's quite evident in employment disputes here, with where you notice that employees maybe take collective action against an employer, is that where you have the likes of a US company operating in a European country, say for talk's sake Ireland or the UK or anywhere, right? They will try to apply the legislation, standards, and practices that would be acceptable in the US in a European context, which is just, they're not compatible, because I mean, European countries are renowned for having, certain safety nets and welfare safeguards, as well as provision for workers' rights.
Mm-hmm.
The Americans don't have that to the same extent, even though they funded a lot of it in the post-war recovery after the defeat of Nazi Germany. But I mean, I think that in a sense, the spread of neoliberalism, it's something it's extremely hard to provide a single definition of.
It involves everything. It involves tax, how you get taxed, your healthcare, your school system, the ballot box. It's everywhere.
Yes, I mean, what toothpaste you use, right down to the smallest things. But in terms of the second question, what a lot of people had asked me in terms of this is for us to distinguish what is the most important way that neoliberalism impacts our lives generally. If you could provide maybe, I don't know, if you could narrow it down to a single sort of thing, which I don't know if a single issue is possible, but I mean, is there an area where you think that it's particularly important, that in terms of its influence more than others?
I don't know if it's come to the north yet, but it's certainly visible in other areas. But the two biggest areas it impacts generally, and you only have to look overseas to see it happening, is in healthcare and public education. Those are the two most coveted institutions or areas of the economy where it can have the most devastating impact. And it does so for a number of different reasons. One is what you said earlier about how it forces companies into competition with lower wage countries, which drives down lower wages here locally.
Yes.
which means you're financially stressed, which means you're more likely to be suicidal, you're more likely to be depressed, you're more likely to use the healthcare system. Therefore, it gives the right wing an agenda to start saying that the national healthcare system isn't working.
Yes.
Exactly. So then they'll start either defunding it or privatizing aspects of it, which makes it worse. And therefore the cycle just dwindles even further. That piece there is huge, because that argument is very, very strong in terms of its rhetoric from the right, saying, oh, the National Health Service isn't working. A couple of reasons why it isn't working. One's the reason I just described. The second is they purposely defund it so that it does break.
You have a flight of labor from it to better paid countries for doctors and nurses. I mean, essentially, one of our biggest exports in Ireland is our doctors and nurses to Australia, and it's almost a historical parallel where the Irish are sent off to Australia as a punishment, so to speak.
Yep, absolutely. And what that does is it legitimizes the privatization of and consolidating the power of private healthcare companies.
Yeah, I mean, it's theft. Let's be honest. It's daylight robbery, because, I mean, the National Health Service as it stands, how we fund it in terms of national insurance is much, much cheaper per household than what it would be if we were all taking out insurance policies to pay for private healthcare. And I mean, as somebody, I've relied on the National Health Service for 2 major surgeries at the age of 29. And I have to say that if I had been living in America and did not have health insurance, one of those operations was priced at $80,000 and another was priced, I think, at around 40,000. But then there were continual treatments therein. So you were looking at a combined total for several years worth of healthcare of in excess of $300,000. Now, what 29-year-old, an average 29-year-old has $300,000 to throw at hospitals in terms of bills and so forth, see private consultants? I mean, it's really quite absurd. I mean, and if you're in that situation, you don't have the insurance, then the alternative is no healthcare at all.
I live here, and I can tell you for a fact, first-hand experience, and I have really good health insurance here. I'm privileged with the job I have, and my wife has a good job, and we have some of the best health insurance you can get. And it's just night and day in terms of the bureaucracy. Number one, the bureaucracy you have to go through to even get an appointment anywhere. It has to go through your PCP provider, then you have to get a referral into somebody else. You're getting charged at both points. There's a middleman taking a cut. I mean, it's your details are registered on all these different systems. I mean, it's just, there's no national database for the healthcare.
There's an incentive there not to go to the doctor.
That's the US has the highest rate of deaths for preventable diseases.
Yes.
In the OECD countries.
And one of the interesting things about that is that for many illnesses, things like diabetes, heart disease, cancer, the wealthiest Americans have the worst outcomes in comparison to some of the poorest Europeans.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's
that's a very
national healthcare and public education.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we mentioned before, but I think it's quite important, is that with a national health service, at least you can regulate it. At least you have the option of where there's regulation and accountability. And if you ask me, what one of the ways of solving the crisis in terms of here with waiting lists, well, there's a number of things, but I think there needs to be more incentives for staff to remain here, so that there's not a flight of labor. And the way to do that is to improve their working conditions, not to defund them. We need to train more doctors and nurses. It needs to be less elitist to get into courses like medicine. There needs to be methods by which people can take a sabbatical and go back in the study, train to become a doctor. I mean, is that not a good thing for society? And not only that, but I actually think the German model, where they do have a national health service, but you have private hospitals that will treat you if you go to them, but they will they're regulated to the point whereby, as I understand it, they can only charge the state the amount that the state would pay to the National Health Service hospital in Germany. So they're not actually undercutting. There's a base rate, and essentially that's maintained irrespective of whether it's a public hospital or a private one. And I think the Germans, when you look at COVID and their ICU capacity, it's 4 times better than, say, the UK.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not advocating necessarily private healthcare, but what I am saying is that if you go into a situation where there is an element of that, then certainly where you have proper regulation from a central government level like that can prevent against unnecessary evils. The cancer waiting list here is horrendous.
Yeah. What would you say to the argument that says, "Oh, you're giving the state too much power by allowing it to run the healthcare system and regulate private business"?
Well, I mean, the way I would get around that is to say that one option that I think would be very good for our own National Health Service is that if you had a board of people who were elected by both the public and the people who work in the National Health Service, who would decide the budget requirements for every single department within the NHS, and then the government would simply put the money up. And that way the citizen, through their vote, and the employee would have the right to hire and fire those who, first of all, decide how much money is required, and then also decide on how it should be allocated. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just one idea that I have, but I think there are certainly others. But I mean, we need to look at the fact that people use this argument all the time, but the distinction is then, well, if the state's not going to provide healthcare, then no one's going to, because if we're going to leave it to the whims of private tyranny and markets, then you're going to have a situation whereby it's going to be a survival of the fittest.
Exactly, and the US's biggest area of bankruptcy for individuals is healthcare bills, yes. Medical bills.
Yeah.
In fact, there's about 30 million Americans who don't have insurance at all, and there's about 80 million that are underinsured. So they therefore then don't go to the doctors because they know they're going to get hit with a bill.
Yeah,
even for an ambulance, to call it an ambulance, something that we take for granted back home, is about a $2,500 charge.
Yes, here. And they want to see your credit card before they check your pulse, so to speak.
Exactly.
But one of the things that I noticed in America whenever I was there in California was the number of people walking around talking to themselves, who were they quite clearly had very severe mental health problems, and there was no actual facility or treatment for them because of the lack of insurance. There was no safeguard.
Yeah.
And they're left to their own devices, which leads to, as you know, things like drugs, the suicide, crime and vice. People feel that there's a schism in their lives, and that really, I think a lot of people are of the view that their lives are meaningless. They're so isolated.
It creates there's a strong link between the neoliberalism and the voter turnout.
Yes.
Because people become, the description you just gave of people feeling hopeless and their lives meaningless, they are apathetic towards their government because their government isn't providing them healthcare. Their government isn't, providing them a public education system where they can go and create new opportunities and create social mobility. It's imposing this survival of the fittest, which is just a theory. It's not even a biological theory of any merit either. So it's just a claim where everyone's in competition with one another. Everyone goes out. It goes back to the point I made at the start. It's about individual liberty. You look after yourself and only yourself. And if you do that, you'll be okay. And that means that some people will win and some people will lose. But what type of system? Even the people who make that claim don't even want that to happen, because if that was true, then you'd have no military, you'd have no infrastructure, you'd have no motorways.
Yes.
This phone, there's 6 technologies that power this phone, and not one of them was invented in the private sector. So
yes, it was government grants.
Every single one of them, GPS, Bluetooth, touchscreen technology, the internet, email, they were all funded by the taxpayer in the United States, either in the military, the Navy, or NASA. we're not getting any benefit out of it other than we have to pay a private company for the benefit of basically a smartphone.
The luxury of enjoying your own taxes.
Exactly. So
one of the things that I would pick up on that is that in terms of people asking what is the most important way it impacts our lives generally, I absolutely would point to healthcare and education. But I think that one of the most obvious ways is social media, in the sense that, I mean, I know there was a recent documentary on it, but the way that social media has taken over to the point whereby people actually live for it. You know, they're living for their Instagram. They're wanting to see, oh, what's so-and-so doing? What can I do to outdo them? And you have this perpetual competition as though life is a race. I mean, people are actually at the point whereby they're comparing each other's children.
I know.
I mean, that's crazy.
I know. It's shocking.
To actually turn around, and they've commercialized it so much with social media that, for example, I seen one particular instance whereby you had mothers who were arguing over which of their daughters had the better Holy Communion dress. In terms of the provider, the dressmaker, to the point of that sort of petty envy of one's neighbor. Well, actually, why don't people just think, well, they both have nice things, and you know what, they're kids, does it really mean this much?
Just enjoy the ceremony.
Yes, I mean, is childhood not supposed to be, a time of joy and discovery and so forth, as opposed to having to be forced into competition with other people because your parents want to be Mr. and Mrs. Smith and keep up with the Joneses?
Exactly. But it's also it's also created cultural phenomenons, and I see this a lot with just people, not necessarily people I know, but there's this obsession nowadays with TED Talks and podcasts around victim blaming and identity politics, and there's a liberal bias and the world's going too far to the left and everyone just needs to sort out their own issues, when the actual opposite is true. If you look at the data, the political system has totally shifted to the right.
Absolutely.
It's only becoming normal now or not normal, but it's only been bringing to light now that the left even has a voice in any serious matters. So now the right are getting upset about it. So somebody else is participating in the political sphere or the public arena. But these podcasts, like Joe Rogan podcasts, they emphasize is what you should do to fix your own problems, how you should go to the gym more, how you should go see therapists and pay it out of your own pocket, how you need to get up at the morning at 7 o'clock in the morning and make your bed and do these things. It's your responsibility.
You need to get your priorities right.
Yes.
It's not we need to get our priorities right. Us as a society.
Yep.
It's you, now.
Yeah. And you're the problem.
Yes, it's a blame game.
It is.
A zero-sum game whereby, the standards that they're setting, first of all, they're non-existent because nobody actually meets them. And secondly, the failure that it results in causes a deep, deep depression in people that lasts for a long time, and in many cases does actually result in suicide.
It does. And it also deepens this concept that we have, or many people have, of government, that the government is some sort of foreign, alien, abstract entity that's operating against them. And in some cases, it is operating against them.
Yes.
But the actual concept of government, especially here more so than anywhere ever been, where they, just even the mention of the word government, it's almost like this deep state is...
Well, the way I would look at it is, let's replace the word government with collective intervention.
Yeah.
That's probably a better term, in the sense that, if you look at it where, say, a company here that employs 500 people is going to go bust because of poor management, is it not better that we have collective state intervention to save that company and keep those people in jobs where they're paying tax, as opposed to throwing them onto the dole where they're dependent on the social security system, and that drains the taxpayer of more resources. Exactly. And they're more likely to need healthcare and other safeguards. I mean, I'm very much an interventionist. I believe that the state has a huge responsibility to intervene within. If we're going to have a capitalist system, then it has to effectively manage the economy. I mean, the French have a phrase for this called dirigisme, whereby essentially that if you look at many of the main enterprises and corporations in France have a social partnership with the government. The government will provide funds and so forth, but in return they'll expect very strong workers' rights and unionization. I mean, in France, you'll find that things like strikes and workers' day, workers' days out, team meetings and so forth, they're very much an upbeat, positive thing. Whereas here, I think a lot of people, the only get together they have outside of work is probably the Christmas dinner, if they even go to it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the third question was provide examples of how the rot has spread into different aspects of life for ordinary people. I mean, we have touched on that, but is there anything that you can think of in particular?
I think it's that's a good question. Do you have any other? I think I've touched on most of it. To be honest,
I think mental health.
Mental health, I see it coming, but I think it's all interconnected. I don't think it's just like isolating it to mental health is a component of all the other policies that are compounding these effects. I actually think it is shifting people that I know and have known for quite a long time who would traditionally have been at least at a minimum center left thinkers, a lot more right wing thinkers, because of this, because the government isn't fixing this, because the system continues to perpetuate itself.
They start to look for scapegoats. They start to look for that.
So there's a shift in that thinking, which I think is showing up in nationalism, not nationalism in the sense of being proud of where you come from and support your national team.
A right-wing xenophobic nationalism.
Racism, anti-immigrants. The LGBT community are asking for too much. How dare women ask for these certain things? What you're saying isn't true. All these, the world's going crazy. All this sort of stuff is just kind of deepening itself, and it's shifting a lot to the right in that sense. And that's where I see it becoming a bigger problem, because it's polarizing society a lot more, and there's only a couple of directions it can go. And there is a serious concern that it could shift so far to the right that you end up with a Donald Trump again.
Or essentially that it'll shift so far that you end up with a situation where society literally just collapses.
And then you leave a power vacuum for an Adolf Hitler to come in, or a Mussolini, or some totalitarian figure that's going to revive the national identity of whatever country they're talking about. And that's when you get racism and xenophobia and anti-Semitism and all that sort of stuff. So
one example I would use to sort of break it down for people and make it very clear is that you'll remember years ago, whenever it was Christmas time, right? You and I would have asked for the latest bicycle, new bike. I would have asked for fishing rods, a football, something like that. Whereas now kids are asking for iPhones. They're asking for laptops. They're asking for really advanced technology, which they don't actually need. I mean, and the thing is, it's a competition to keep up with, so and so down the street, and parents are funding it. They're complicit in it because they want to be seen to be good parents, so to speak, in providing that. They're providing material care, so to speak, but I mean, I think it takes away from the spiritual and emotional element of parenting very much, because those sort of things, the Facebook, the Twitter, the Instagram, it isolates the child from the parent and the family unit. It also isolates them from their friends. I mean, you'll remember that when we were young, you used to like to get on your bike and go out a cycle or play a game of football, Gaelic, do things together as a collective unit, so to speak. Whereas now there's not so much of that. And particularly during the pandemic, it's become horrendous. But I mean, as a necessity though. But I mean, Christmas itself, I think, has become so commercialized and so atomized that each year, in a sense, it reinforces the problem.
It does, and there's a lot of studies done on this as well, and once you've established a certain level of luxury and needs that are being met, but yet you continue to consume more goods, like trinket goods, like toys and stuff.
Yes.
You buy gadgets you don't need. Your happiness actually declines, doesn't increase.
Yes, because people find that once they obtain it, it actually doesn't provide the satisfaction that they expected it to do.
Exactly.
I mean, it's the difference of to have or to be.
Yep.
And I mean, you often hear that the term in Shakespeare's Hamlet, to be or not to be, that is the question. And what they're actually stating, I mean, as I understand it, what Shakespeare's thinking was behind that was that the real merit of it is to be ourselves or not to be ourselves. And by that, he was referring to the sovereignty of a person. And in order, the way I look at it is, for a person to be able to exercise sovereignty over their own life, they also have to be, in a way, like a country, allied to other people who are stakeholders within their life. Okay. And I mean, no one is an island under themselves, and you couldn't survive that way.
Even people who claim to be self-made millionaires, or I'm self-made, that's just not true.
There's no such thing as a self-made man.
It's untrue. They've benefited off a lot of services and taxpayer funded.
Yeah, even if you take away from the financial aspect of it, they've benefited from maybe the goodwill of their neighbors and their parents and so forth, asking about them, encouraging them, siblings, people helping them in different ways. It doesn't always have to be material, but the encouragement.
Yep,
I think that's a big thing. Young people nowadays really, really lack encouragement.
They do. Another area that shows up in terms of examples is housing.
Oh, there's a huge issue with that, especially in North Belfast.
It's affected the housing market all over the world.
Yeah.
In the US, Britain, even all over Western Europe, it used to be so much easier to get access to the housing market in the 50s and the 60s when, as you said, the Keynesian economic model was in place, which basically means that it was better regulated. The state had a much more active role in stimulating the economy and regulating the economy. Whereas now, the banks are basically creating money on the speculation on the future
of people's homes
and the future value of a house. But it's not based on any scientific merits. It's just based on a theory of that's its true value, and therefore what that does, it drives up the value for one property, then everyone bull rushes to the next, and everyone starts keeping investing in their properties as an investment rather than a house to live in, and keeps driving up the price of properties.
You see
a false economy. So
what I think in terms of looking at that, the origin of it was Margaret Thatcher brought in legislation where it gave people the right to buy their council house, right? And essentially, that's one of the reasons she was re-elected. And people said it was the only good thing she did. It wasn't actually a good thing, because if she had allowed people to buy their council house and continued to build houses at the same rate that they had done before, then that would have been okay. But the thing is, she drastically cut the rate of housing that was being built, which meant she knew that the value of houses already in existence would go up, and that people would have a false sense of financial security where they would borrow against that. And the problem is, when that bubble crashes, the party's over.
Well,
so to speak.
But the thing is that the government, the banks are doing so on the implicit 100% perfect insurance policy. They're always going to do that because they know they're going to get bailed out.
Absolutely.
It's the only insurance policy that ever pays out 100%.
Yes, and what I mean, we're living in interesting times in the sense that, I mean, in the UK, I mean, there is a neoliberal conservative government there, right? but it has also been the most interventionist government ever, in the sense that you look at the furlough scheme. If they had not introduced it and left people to market forces, society would literally have collapsed.
It would have.
They had to intervene to help out the employers to retain their staff by saying, we will pay 80% of the staff's wages, but also depleting their purchasing power by not paying 100%, but we will pay 80% so that you retain your staff and you avoid having to claim off your insurance policy. They done it to bail out the insurance industry and also to bail out the employers.
Yeah. That's why I never really subscribe to the term that we have a capitalist society. We don't have we have a state capitalist society. There's never been a fully capitalist society, and there never will be. Markets cannot function on their own without a state. That's why there's the people who even claim to be neoliberals aren't. They just aren't.
Yes, because you can't have neoliberalism without the state.
Exactly.
That's the thing about it. Someone has to enforce it.
Yep.
Someone has to impose it on other people. And, I think leading into the fourth question, whereby what people have asked is, what weapons do ordinary people have to combat it and transform the system within the limited circumstances of what we call a liberal democracy? So what sort of safeguards exist, do you think, for ordinary people?
The same playbook has played out for a millennia, and it will continue to play out for the next millennia. It's always the owners of production and labor will always have a direct conflict, but the same mechanisms that have been true thousands of years ago are still true today: is organize, protest, join community groups, and associate with others. Be active in the political arena as much as you can, make your voice heard. The liberal leaders have never, that I know of, I think this is a historical universal, I've never known of a policy that has dramatically improved the lives of working class people that has just been concocted by magic from the leaders in government. It's always been done under the social pressure of the time in which it was passed. So, for example, the 40-hour work week, they didn't just hand that out. People fought for it and went on strike for it. Environmental laws, people went on strike for it. People fought for it. People unionized and put it on the legislative agenda. The workers' rights, the segregation laws here in the United States, the what else? The National Health Service, even Medicaid here in the United States. Every single one of
it was a grassroots pressure.
Pressure. So if you're going to get anything done, there's two big elements to it. One is educational programs. Continue to do things like this. Talk about it in public. Make sure that people feel as if they're not alone and isolated. That's number one. But number two is join political organizations where you can put pressure on your elected leaders and keep them accountable to your agenda and your demands. They are not the rulers; they are there to serve. And if they're not serving, then it's a dysfunctional democracy.
Yeah, they're public servants, not public czars.
Exactly. So to me, there's actually a great book that I would advise people to read. It's called the history of the U.S. in 10 labor strikes. It's applicable to Britain as well and Ireland. In the sense that every single one of the policies that are beneficial here, like your pension and healthcare, have all been done under the same conditions. Beautiful book, and it just shows that there's what I've just described. That if you want to get something done, join a church group, join a political organization, join a union, come on podcasts, write about it on social media, create Facebook groups, and just put the people in government under pressure. And that's the only way that I can see that things will get done.
Yeah, I think as well, just adding on to that, in terms of the workplace, I think people need to discuss things more and collectivize, even if it means setting up a WhatsApp group or, using social media to their own advantage. In terms of any quarrels with management, they need to approach it from a collective point of view and not allow themselves to be isolated. Yeah. On top of that, I would say they really need to have the balls, so to speak, to actually exercise their legal rights. and hold employers to account. I mean, sometimes they need to put manners on them and go down that route, whether it's through a tribunal or the High Court. I noticed that one of the changes that this is a tip to many people, is that here you cannot get legal aid for a tribunal case against an employer. But I know of certain instances whereby, because of the stress and depression that employers have caused by their treatment of employees, what the employees have done in a shrewd and canny way is actually took the employer into the High Court for an emotional, psychiatric, psychological, personal injury case where they can get legal aid and state intervention. So, I mean, there's a loophole within very limited mechanisms that we have to actually hold people to account, in that if you can't get any sort of support and assistance from the state to go into a tribunal, but you can get it to go into the High Court on the premise that they've caused you personal injury, which they, in almost all cases, they have. I don't know anyone that isn't stressed if they're going through stuff like that in work. Then that's something for them to use.
That's a great example.
Yeah, I mean, I know of one particular person that I know, that was one way that canny solicitor advised them to get round it. But I mean, it stuck with me, in that I think more and more people need to do that and set those precedents.
Yeah, they absolutely do. I'm going to have to go soon. So, what other questions have we got?
Just the concluding question is really: do you see that change is happening soon, and if so, what are the signs of it? Just as a concluding.
So things can seem all doom and gloom because the media and general social media amplifies the negativity bias in humans, and everything's falling apart, the world's doomed. But there is, and the media don't say this, but there is an absolutely enormous progressive democratic socialist movement, not just in the United States, but across Europe.
Everywhere. Yes, everywhere. Most people are progressive.
They are, exactly, by research studies, by surveys taken, they are.
Yes.
There's an institution called Progressive International, which is led by Yanis Varoufakis.
Yes.
I think Noam Chomsky's on the board. I think Naomi Klein is part of that organization. So basically what they're doing is using that their weight of voice to pressure the European Union in particular, but also Washington and any government bodies to put the two main points. One is the environmental disaster, and the second one is nuclear war, and the third one is the disintegration of democracy. So just by even going and looking at those organizations, by going and reading more about Bernie Sanders and his campaign, looking at I wouldn't even call it the successes, but there's some progressive thinkers in the Labour Party, not the Keir Starmers, but there's there's people on the split of that party,
the non-Tony Blair wing,
non-Tony Blair wing. By pressing their concerns, they can help change the agenda and the legislation that's being put forward by Keir Starmer. Bernie Sanders is probably the one example I know the most. Like, he is the most popular politician in the United States by far.
But because he says what he means what he says. You can't ask for more than that.
Exactly. But going back to the neoliberalism argument, is that neoliberalism has made people who would vote for Bernie Sanders maybe not turn out for him because they do think it's hopeless, and they're fighting against such a powerful beast.
I think the system is rigged so that someone like that can't actually get into office. But exactly. I mean, what I would say is that, democracy is an evolving process, and I think that Brexit was a big example of that, in the sense that I think that people were tired of being told what to do by foreign entities in Brussels. And I know that there was a lot of racism and xenophobia connected to the Brexit argument, but essentially I think there was also a democratic aspect to it as well, that people should have control in terms of national sovereignty over their laws, their finances, and their affairs. And I mean, it was a bombshell waiting to happen. And the whole question is, will that domino effect take place with other states? The European Union, one of the good things, the signs of change that I see happening, is that during the pandemic, they're now using that as an excuse to nationalize the debts that were incurred as a result of the crash in 2008. I think that's a good sign. One of the other things that I would say just before we conclude is the fact that people like us we're having these conversations. You know, more and more people are becoming aware and interested in this. They're reading up on it and so forth. I think that you have a population now which is well to the left of the government.
Me too. I agree. I mean, just to add to your examples, Joe Biden is in power here in the United States. He is not a progressive, but yet his legislative agenda right now is the most progressive in probably 35 years, maybe 40 years.
Because of public pressure.
Because of public pressure from the Black Lives Movement, the Sunrise Movement. So the Sunrise Movement is a young, politically active organization here, which basically forced the Green New Deal for better environmental policies to be put on the agenda. Without it, like, so now Biden has some very, not perfect, but decent proposals for getting the country off fossil fuels, electrifying the government fleet. He's banning the pipeline that's going, just put a hold on the pipeline that's going through the country at the minute. He's stopped oil rigging or oil drilling in Alaska, and starting to put more funds towards wind turbines, hydropower, solar panels, research and development.
It's really, it's a government of common sense as opposed to,
exactly. So
we had before.
There's some positive signs that things could go in that direction, but only way it's going to keep going like that is if popular pressure is maintained and they keep, as Chomsky would say, keep their foot on the gas pedal and put these people on edge, keep them accountable.
Yes, I mean, the perpetual struggle between those who own everything and control everything and essentially those who they seek to control and own.
Exactly.
And I think more and more people need to do what we're doing now and have these discussions and essentially act on them. You know, it's not good enough just simply to discuss it. I mean, they need to collectivize, they need to come together and need to form community groups. Or, I mean, whether it's, you know, I know a lot of people who have children with autism, and one of the things they've done because of a lack of services is they've come together to support each other as parents around a common cause. And I think that's an excellent idea.
I think that is a great idea.
Yeah, but I know you have to go, so we'll leave it at that, and we'll continue this conversation again in terms of this particular subject.
Appreciate your time, Donal. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Cheers.
Take care. Bye.
You too.